Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. Update 46 is live on the PTS. I spent about 5 hours going through the patch notes over on Twitch. The review starts about 2 hours in. If you're brave enough to watch the whole thing, I'll link it down below. But for here on YouTube, this will be my summary video covering my initial thoughts on the changes. There's some really good stuff Zos has done here, but also quite a few changes I think are taking a step backwards. I won't go over the basic additions to the game that we already learned about last week. I have a video covering all of that if you're needing to get caught up there. This will instead be focused on the combat and balance changes. So first off, the new item sets. We haven't had a patch where I've been excited about gear in a while, and sadly this does not change with update 46. The overland sets all seem fine for newer players, but not really anything beyond that. Interestingly, we only got one craftable set. This is actually probably my favorite new 5-piece set of the update. It gives 12% direct damage done to monsters. I do think this is slightly undertuned still. 15% would be a better spot for it, but for a craftable option, this should work decently for players that are focused into direct damage. For the trial sets, sadly, I'm not excited about any of them. The light DPS set gives you damage when you take synergies, but it only stacks up to 430 weapon damage. So you have to take 5 synergies just to get to that low amount and then maintain constantly taking synergies within a 10-second window to keep it up. Just seems like a lot of work for not much damage. Even if you only needed one synergy to immediately hit 430, I still don't think this would be a great set. So definitely not with needing to stack it up 5 times. Then the medium DPS set cannot critically strike, which really hurts the potential of it. Now, I could be wrong, but it's hard for me to see a very good use case for this one. Just seems like it takes too long to go off for trash, and there aren't a ton of bosses that have enough enemies stacked up, but definitely underwhelmed by this one at the moment. Quick edit here. It does seem like this set is actually bugged right now on the PTS. The max hit was even lower than the absorbed stamina glyph, so something's not right. I'll be interested to see how this stacks up once some adjustments are made. Then the healer set, it gives a burst of resources, but only once every 30 seconds, straight to the wood chipper. Then the tank set actually offers a pretty nice armor debuff, but it requires you to maintain holding block to keep it up. So I thought maybe you would get a 2-second grace period since it's a 2-second buff to not block and keep the debuff. It seemed kind of buggy when I was testing it though, so I'm not sure what the intention is there. It's an interesting idea, but I think the way it works needs to be tweaked a little to have it be a little bit more usable. For the mythics, we got the Mad God's Dancing Shoes. These are just a goofy mythic. I don't really see them having a purpose other than for roleplay. The Monomyth Reforged Ring could have some PvP implications, but I don't really see this one being useful in PvE. I thought it was kind of a weird choice to put negative effects on it. It didn't really seem strong enough to warrant that. And then finally, the Medium Shoulder is really the standout for me. It's a really nice mythic choice for heavy attack builds. It does get rid of the resource return on your heavies, but gives you a massive 50% increase to their damage. You'll just need to run your own source of empower with this. So even if you prefer a 1-bar setup, there's going to be a lot of options to run a 2-bar build that mostly just sit on 1 bar and have a much higher ceiling than the Oaken Soul setups. So this might be worth checking out if you do like heavy attack builds. There were a few pre-existing gear sets that also got adjusted. Footman's Fortune now blocks 14%, up from 8%. Azure Blight now requires 20 additional stacks of Blight Seed for each group member wearing the set. Pretty much nukes it for the way it's currently used. If you do have a scenario where you're the only one in it and you get good damage that way, then it should still be good in that use case, but it gets worse and worse the more people you put in this set. Then Slivers of the Null Arca got a really nice buff. I wasn't expecting this. The damage was increased by about 8% and the cooldown was lowered to 4 seconds from 5. So this seems to be a really great option for pure single target damage. All right, moving on to the class balance changes. There were a ton of adjustments, so I won't go through every little minor detail, but I will cover all the main stuff here. I'm going to start with the big winners from this patch, Nightblade and Templar. For Nightblade, the assassination line got some nice buffs. The Master Assassin passive now increases your crit chance by 8.8% against enemies you flank instead of adding penetration. I think this is a much better choice for a situational buff like this. Pen is something that you have to really build around and can often end up wasted, so this fits the theme much better, I think, for flanking. They also got a slight buff to pressure points, 2.5% crit chance for each assassination ability slotted, up from 2. And then Grim Focus got a nice rework. It now stacks up to 10 times rather than up to 5, but the weapon and spell damage is reduced to 45 for Grim Focus and Merciless Resolve, down from 60, and then reduced to 60 for Relentless Focus, down from 80. So at the normal 5 stacks, you'll be a little lower than before, but you can stack it twice as high now. So Merciless Resolve can stack up to 450 weapon weapon and spell damage, and Relentless Focus can stack up to 600 weapon and spell damage. Kind of crazy. So the way that it works now, when you're firing it, it just reduces your stack count by 5. So if you were at 7, for example, when you fired it, you'd go down to 2 stacks. This is much more forgiving than the previous version, as any stacks past the 5 there were just lost. You can even save it till 10 now if you want and fire back-to-back bow procs. It's really cool change here and a nice buff to this ability. For the Shadow line, not a lot here, but the Dark Vigor passive now gives you 5% max health per Shadow ability instead of 3. For the Siphoning line, the Catalyst passive gives you 30 ult when you drink a potion instead of 20, and the Magicka Flood passive gives you both Magicka and Stamina instead of just Magicka. So overall, I really like the changes here to the Nightblade. Really felt like they were well thought through from top to bottom. I was worried we'd see a bunch of nerfs, but in fact got the opposite. So even without subclassing, a pure Nightblade will still go up in power here. All right, next up is Templar. Zos was cooking with these changes. We'll start with the Adric Spear line. Jab's got a really nice buff as it now does its full damage to enemies in an AoE instead of reduced damage to all but the primary target. So Jabs has about the same tooltip as Wrecking Blow when you add all 3 components together. So essentially this is like getting Wrecking Blow spam in an AoE. It was already a great skill and now it's even better. There is one awful change that accompanied this though, and that is it's limited to a 6 target cap, which we'll see again in the Arcanist section in a bit. Long time ago, we used to have target caps for damage and ESO, and they got rid of them because they felt awful. So I really dislike this idea of going back to having these. If this is a PvP performance concern, maybe consider having it only capped in PvP areas. It just feels really bad to watch your abilities go right through enemies and deal no damage, so I hope that they'll reconsider this one. Maybe at least give it a shot first with no cap and let's see how it goes. For the 2 morphs here, Puncturing Sweeps got the healing reduced to 25% of the damage done, so they said this will result in less healing against 1 enemy, while being almost the same against 2 and greatly increasing at 3+ enemies. For Biting Jabs, this got the status effect chance to proc Sundered up to 10%. This might not seem like a ton, but with the increased percent chances to this, and then the fact that it hits 3 times in 1 second, and in an AoE, this will be a very nice source of extra Sundered procs now. Still not a big fan of the 10 seconds of Major Brutality and Sorcery on this skill. It's just way too low of the timer, and so you end up needing another reliable source in your kit for this, which effectively makes this end up as a dead bonus on this skill. So I'd love to see something else there instead, or maybe put this bonus on the base skill as just a passive for slotting it and have it work on both morphs. The Burning Light passive has had its scaling changed. This looks to be a very small nerf for most setups. Shouldn't end up making much of a difference overall. Spear Wall now grants Minor Berserk on top of the Minor Protection, so a nice little buff there. Piercing Spear goes up to 12% from 10% crit damage. Not a huge increase, but hey, another buff. And then Spear Shards got a really cool rework. Luminous Shards now allows you to take your own synergy, so I thought this was a pretty cool idea. I'd love to see something like this on the Sorcerer with their Lightning Splash ability. And then the Blazing Spear morph is getting about 10% more damage overall. The upfront hit will be reduced some, as Jabs is just going to be a way better AoE spam anyways, but the dot it leaves behind will be doing way more damage than before. So we got some really great changes all throughout the Adric Spear line. Templars are eating good this patch. And then in the Dawn's Wrath line, their famous Jesus Beam ability has been reworked. The channel on it is now 4.8 seconds instead of 1.8 seconds. So I actually really like this change a lot. If you need to block or something, you can always cancel it early, just like you could with the 1.8 second channel. But now you can just hold it for a longer period without having to reapply it. It does drain 1157 Magicka per tick instead of the upfront cost of 2950. So it's a little more expensive to cast now, but don't think it feels too bad. The damage per tick is now 12% higher at the base, and both morphs scale up to 500% increased damage, but they no longer start scaling at 50%. There's a little nerf here. Instead, this will vary based on the morph. So Radiant Glory doesn't start gaining execute damage until 30%. The cost on this morph is reduced by 33% down to 771 per tick, and the healing is increased to 20% instead of the 17% it is on live. So quite a bit longer you wait to start using this one. Then for Radiant Oppression, this morph starts scaling at 39% instead of the 50% it is on live. So I I made a couple of charts to sum up the changes here. This is just some quick math, so it might not be perfect, but should be a rough idea. These are the old and new tick values for each morph. So the base is now higher, but it starts scaling later. So what we have is this middle section where the old version was better, but after about 15% on oppression and about 10% on glory, the new versions will pass up the old ones. If I had to make a very general guess at what percent you'd start using these in your rotation, obviously it'll vary based on your spammable, I'd say probably about 30 to 35% to use Radiant Oppression and about 20 to 25% on Radiant Glory, but both morphs still seem very strong and each have their uses. It does look like the difference between the two is a little bit further apart for damage than it was in the previous patch. On live, there's almost no damage difference between them, not a very noticeable one anyways, but now Oppression does kind of pull ahead towards the very end of the fight. They do kind of meet back up again, but Oppression is definitely the clear choice for more damage now, and Glory for the healing and the reduced cost. Overall, this is probably a slight nerf to the total damage you'll get with this execute ability, but the last 10 to 15% of a fight should go even faster now as that section has been buffed. Overall, I like the changes here pretty well, but I could see this one being a bit more controversial. Quick edit in here. After initially recording this, I've seen some more feedback around this ability, and it does seem like it probably needs some work. It is apparently very hard to sustain on the Templar, which used to be able to quite easily with the Radiant Glory morph, and given the really good DPS passives in some of the other damaging lines, nerfing Jesus Beam, even by a small amount, doesn't seem like it was probably the right call. I'd say it probably even needs to be buffed from live, as you sacrifice a lot of damage passives to run this skill line on a DPS. So maybe there's some creative solution they can come to here to make this line a bit more enticing. Lightweaver got a really interesting change. Instead of the armor bonus, it now allows you to automatically block all attacks for 2 seconds at no cost when you start any channel or cast time ability. I think this is a really cool idea. It has a 15-second cooldown, so it isn't overpowered. You can't just constantly have it up while you're channeling. It has to be used more strategically. So for a damage dealer using beam or jabs, it's going to be up pretty randomly and unreliably. However, on a tank, for example, let's say you've been blocking attacks, but now you need to heavy attack for resources. While you're heavy attacking, you'll still be blocking. You won't have to worry about taking unblocked damage. Really interesting idea, I think. Could also work with something like Meditate in the Psijic Order line. If you know a big hit is coming in, you could channel this right before and take advantage of the 30% mitigation in the Psijic passives while also still blocking the attack. Or if you just want to use it for short bursts of resources and stay safe while you're doing it. So overall, I really like the Templar changes. I think this one and the Nightblade skill lines seemed the most well thought through, and all the changes really made sense and make the classes more fun and interesting in my opinion. So yeah, GG Zoss, I really like what you did here. Now, if only all the classes got the same level of love sent their way. All right, these next few classes weren't buffed quite as well as the Nightblade and Templar. I don't think they probably needed to be. They're really strong, and I feel okay about where they landed. For the Herald of the Tome line, Fate Carver had its cost increased by a massive 40%. This is definitely noticeable. Might have to start running some recovery food. It's not the end of the world, but it definitely hurts sustain. But alongside of that, it also had its damage buffed by 8%. So there's that trade-off there. The part I like the least though, they've added a 6 target cap onto Beam. I won't go through all the same stuff I already said in the Templar section, but really don't like this trend of adding target caps here. Then for the Splintered Secrets passive, you will get a little bit more penetration from that now. For the Curative Runeform skill line, Reconstructive Domain was fixed to properly heal the lower health targets, so that's a nice fix that's gone in. The Hideous Clarity passive now gives you both Magicka and Stamina back instead of just your higher of the two. For Soldier of Apocrypha, quite a large armor buff to Aegis of the Unseen. You now get an extra 3271 armor, so pretty nice buff there. And there's a small nerf to the passive recovery on Wellspring of the Abyss, down to 81 instead of 129. So overall for the Arcanist, not really anything too crazy except for that cost increase to the Fate Carver Beam. That's the one that people will really have to account for. Next is the Necromancer. We did get some global summoning changes that mostly will affect Necros. There's a cap of 10 summons, including your created corpses in PvE, but this drops to 5 in PvP. There's a whole list of how this works here in the patch notes, but essentially it shouldn't bug out anymore when you try and cast Blast Bones because you had too many corpses already made. It'll just remove a corpse instead. For the Gravelord line, Flameskull and its morphs can now create corpses on those empowered third casts. Venom Skull did get a 3-second cooldown with doing this, and this functionality was removed from Gravelord's Sacrifice since it's now just on the base ability. The Death Knell passive used to be 10% crit chance to enemies under 25% health per Gravelord ability slotted. Now it's just a flat 20% against targets under 33% health. So you do get this to kick in a little sooner at that 33%, but the high end of what could be achieved here has been brought down. You'll often see Necros using 4 abilities to get this to 40%. So it's a bit of a nerf for pure Necros using it this way, but for someone that just wants 1 or 2 skills from this line, maybe in subclassing, this is actually a much better version for that use case. So it kind of depends on how you're set up here. It's a really strong passive still. They also got a nice boost to their offensive penetration with the Dismember passive, now giving 3271 instead of 1500. So really big penetration buff there. For the Bone Tyrant line, Empowering Grasp now offers Major Maim and AoE. So we're starting to get more and more sources of AoE Major Maim. Every new one they add in just makes Solar Prison feel worse and worse. I really would like them to revisit that ultimate, maybe get rid of the Maim and actually make it useful for damage. But anyways, back to Necro. The Last Gasp passive gives Necros a nice health increase of 2412 up from 1250. So a decent little buff there. Then for the Living Death line, some adjustments to Curative Curse, Near-Death Experience, and Undead Confederate. I think the first two probably mostly cancel each other out with the healing amounts there, but there is a small recovery nerf on that last one. So overall for Necros, not really anything too crazy in one direction or the other. They didn't really get anything exciting added, but they already have some of the best passives and skills and are going to have some of the most sought after lines for subclassing for sure. All right, next up is the Warden. We'll start with Animal Companions. Slight buff to the healing from Bond with Nature, increase to the recoveries from Flourish, and then they increased the crit damage from Advanced Species to 5% per Animal Companion ability slotted. So nothing too major here, just some slight buffs across the board to this skill line. For the Green Balance line, the key one here is Emerald Moss. You now get 5% more healing done per Green Balance ability slotted, up from 2%. So that could be quite a massive increase with enough skills from this line. And then for Winter's Embrace, Northern Storm was reworked a bit. The damage of the ultimate was nerfed by 33%. However, the stacking damage done portion was greatly buffed by 2% per stack, and it now lasts for 20 seconds. The storm portion is still only 8 seconds, but the damage increase continues for another 12 seconds after it's done. And with 2% per stack, that is 18% increased damage done for those final 12 seconds. I think it's pretty intriguing. I would like to see the storm just last for the full 20 seconds with you, even if it was less bursty. I think the idea of that all following you around for that long period of time just sounds really cool. I know it's really strong in PvP, so they have to work out the details there, but kind of feels strange that the damage portion falls off, but your damage buff just sticks around for another 12 seconds. Then the Glacial Presence passive was also reworked a little bit. Chilled status chance was increased from 200 to 250%. And the scaling of the damage done was changed to only scale with weapon and spell damage now, the same as that Burning Light change. So this is a small nerf, but still hits really hard, and you will trigger it more often now with the increased chance. So I think overall this change is fine. You're still going to get a ton of chilled damage in your kit. Frozen Armor now gives 1240 armor per ability slotted instead of 990. Icy Aura triggers Major Maim on your enemy if they attack you 5 times. There is a 3-second window between attacks that it can fall off. So this one is a little bit strange. It's kind of a weird passive, but I guess it could be okay in some scenarios for a free Major Maim on the target without slotting anything for it. I don't know. Still kind of unsure about how I feel about this one. Piercing Cold is probably the change I am least fond of here on the Warden. It's not bad, but I think it could use some tweaks. Instead of having that weird condition where you get either block mitigation or damage done, it just gives you a flat 8% block mitigation and 10% frost damage increase. So this is quite a big nerf on the damage side unless you have 80% or more of your damage as frost damage, which you pretty much never see as the case, even on heavily frost-focused builds. So I'd love to see this one revisited a bit. I saw some suggestions from ESO Nightingale on the forums that I thought looked pretty good. Probably like the crit chance one, the best of the 3 here, but I think it needs something that boosts some of your other damage too. 10% just to frost damage probably won't cut it here. All right, then the final section for the classes will be the biggest losers of the patch. the Dragonknight, and the Sorcerer. So we'll start with Dragonknight. The Combustion passive got a small nerf to the damage. It's only 33% additional damage to burning and poison instead of 40%, but it had a pretty large nerf to the sustain. It only returns 423 magicka and stamina now instead of 1,000. However, the damage loss is mostly made up by the Warmth passive. That one got a nice buff to add 6% damage to your damage over time abilities. I was pretty excited when I first read this. They were the first ones listed in the patch notes, but sadly, compared to the buffs that some of the other classes received, DK feels like they definitely got the short end of the stick here. It's nice to have for sure, but this line definitely seems to be lagging behind some of the other classes' main damage lines. Like the Arcanist, DK got a nice buff to their armor, now getting 2974 from the scaled armor passive instead of 1650. And then for the Earthen Heart line, some big nerfs to DKs here. Magma Armor and the Magma Shell Morph now have the same limitation that Corrosive Armor has, where you can't generate ultimate while it's active. So no more permanent Magma Shell builds. This does have quite a few implications for endgame tanking and for pushing deep into the Infinite Archive. Overall, I think it's a healthy adjustment for the game. It's still a strong ultimate as a backup when things go south, but personally, I don't think you should have ever been able to keep this up at all times. But we'll see how people adjust from this one. And then finally, the Battle Roar passive was nerfed. 37 resources per ult spent, down from 50. Still a nice passive for sustain, but not quite as cracked as it was before. So overall, not really a lot of good stuff for DKs. They got a bunch of nerfs, and they did get the Warmth adjustment for the dot damage. Really feels like they kind of got left behind a bit and stuck with more nerfs than buffs. So I hope to see some more done here to incentivize their skill lines. And then finally, the class I feel like is having the biggest identity crisis right now, the Sorcerer. We'll start with the Daedric summoning line. They said we're removing the separation of a pet versus no pet build in this skill line now that subclassing is here. Those who do not wish to interact with the pet gameplay can now replace this skill line as a whole. Many abilities in this skill line have been adjusted with this in mind. And man, I really don't like this change. I'd say if this line was only pets, okay, that's fine. But there are some really nice no pet skills in this line still, like Haunting Curse, Bound Aegis, Bound Armaments, Conjured Ward, and its morphs. And then the Atronach is only a temporary pet, not a permanent one. So they're pretty much saying, sorry if you like any of these skills. If you don't want pets with them, go take a different skill line. And if you don't, you end up with a tree full of dead passives just to take one of these skills here. It's really bad, but I'll go ahead and go through all of it. So Conjured Ward and Hardened Ward were nerfed. They no longer have a heal if you don't have any pets active. And then Regenerative Ward has a 5% heal if you do have a pet active. Daedric Prey was buffed from 45 to 50%, but now it only affects Sorcerer pets. So I'm also not a big fan of this change. This skill was one of the only use cases for the Maw of the Inferno set, and many other pet-based sets, these will just not work that well anymore. They are all pretty heavily underperforming without the Daedric Prey buff, so I think it's kind of sad that they got rid of that interaction. Also, people had the idea of buffing their pets from other skill lines. This won't work there either. That I understand a bit more. That could have gotten really crazy, but still, I feel like there could be a better spot to land in overall. Daedric Protection now requires a Daedric summoning ability to be active instead of having one slotted. It is a nice 5% damage taken decrease if you are running pets, but again, they're forcing into that pet setup here. Expert Summoner gives you 5% health, magicka, and stamina if you are running a permanent pet, and then nothing if you aren't. So y'all sensing a theme here. Then Bound Armaments, this ability now stacks up to 8 times, up from 4, so that it is less punishing and has a flexible fit into the crystal weapon rotation. Activating the ability will still only shoot up to 4 of the bound daggers at a time. Reduce the damage per bound dagger by 10%. So I do like the increase to 8, similar to what they did with Grim Focus and doubling the stacks. However, I'm absolutely baffled as to why they nerfed the damage here. Grim Focus was already a stronger skill than this, and Grim Focus got better, while this one got even worse. So I'm just kind of scratching my head with this one. Even if you account for this passive being active at all times, it's not nearly as strong as the weapon and spell damage you get from Grim Focus, so that shouldn't be a factor. This skill's just worse than that one in every way, and it's locked behind a line that you have to have pets for. I also found it weird that they brought up Crystal Weapon when that isn't in this skill line. So maybe this skill could get moved to Dark Magic and buffed a little bit. You'd still have Haunting Curse stuck in the pet line, which kind of sucks, but at least one of these abilities could be saved. And just to be clear, for those that do want to run pets, this skill line is still very strong. I'm just sad about the skills within this line that I enjoyed using on non-pet builds that I'll likely have to give up now. For the Dark Magic line, Crystal Fragments, this ability's passive slot function now persists through bar swap, allowing cast from both bars to potentially trigger the instant cast version. So this is a really nice change here. You'll get more frag procs since you can trigger them on your back bar now. Then the Persistence passive got a slight buff to 18%, up from 15%. And that's it for the Dark Magic line. Pretty underwhelming here. For Stormcalling, Hurricane got a bug fix, but I'd like to see this in Boundless Storm get an initial tick when you cast them. Kind of weird that they don't. Mage's Fury got nerfed from 4 seconds down to 2 seconds. This is a pretty big PvP nerf. Would love to see this skill get some PvE love, as it's pretty much the worst execute in the game for PvE. Capacitor moved to flat recovery amounts instead of percent. This should be a decent buff for lower recovery builds, but it will be a nerf for high recovery builds. And then the Expert Mage passive was nerfed slightly for high-end play. They changed to 108 weapon and spell damage per Sorc ability slotted instead of 2%. I think this one could definitely be buffed up more. Overall, Sorcerer just kind of feels like pets are bust, and they feel really underwhelming compared to the other classes. Not much love given to them outside of their pet setups, and even some disappointing changes to disable the fun functions with pet-based setups. So I do hope Sorcerers can get some more love over the course of the PTS. So that wraps up the class balance changes, and while I do think Templar and Nightblade were the winners with their changes, doesn't mean those are the only top options for skill lines to run for DPS. Necromancer and Arcanist are currently insanely good. The best performing option I've seen so far is Gravelord, Herald of the Tome, and Assassination, but it's still very early on in the PTS, and I'm sure a lot more will unfold. There were a couple of scribing changes as well. Ulfsild's Contingency got a small cost increase for the damaging versions and a rather large cost increase for the shield and healing versions. And then Banner Bearer was changed to not reduce recovery, but instead drain resources every 2 seconds. This is a decent sized nerf for PvE setups for DPS. I was still able to run it, but it definitely chunked my sustain a lot harder. The annoying part is that it drains out of combat too. I feel like it should at least only drain while you're in combat. It's not the end of the world, but kind of annoying too. Another thing that was not listed in the patch notes, the green craft tree got some adjustments. Several of the stars were reduced in cost, and then there was a new star that was actually added to increase your XP gain on your skill lines by 15%. And thank you to Sir Banana for putting together this image. So overall, I actually really like a lot of what's going on here. I was pretty critical, but we're early in the PTS, and now is the time to be critical of the things that can be improved. Impressions so far on the PTS, sustain is definitely harder across the board, especially if you're multi-classing into some of the stronger DPS options. Dragonknight, Sorcerer, and Warden feel like they need the most improvements. Nightblade's Assassination and Necro's Gravelord are definitely the leaders in just taking skill lines for strong passive boosts. And then the Arcanist Beam seems to be the top beneficiary of all these boosts. Templar's pretty solid, but their two main damage lines are kind of split, and so neither one seems to be able to output quite as much as Assassination, Gravelord, and Herald of the Tome. But I think we're in a decent place to start with all this. Just need some work giving those underperforming classes a little bit of love, and I think this could be phenomenal. Thank you so much for watching. I know there was a lot here. It's quite a lot to process. Let me know what you all think about the patch notes and what combinations you've been coming up with. Big thanks to those that have supported with Patreon and YouTube memberships, and a special thanks to these folks here. I couldn't keep doing this without you. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.